welcome to another edition of Splitting Hairs with Max and Nicky.
I'm Max.
And I'm Nicky.
And together we're
Max and Nicky.
This episode we'll be talking about art critics. Art critics, and what we mean by art, we mean
Just film,
television, music,
theater.
Well, those are all performing arts we mentioned, but also, fine arts as well.
And even just fine arts. But
I just said that.
Oh, okay. Whoops, I wasn't listening.
What do we think about them? Do we like them? Do we think they're necessary? And do we think they add a great deal to...
I mean, what are the negatives and positives?
What are the negatives and positives
of art critics?
Of critique.
Before we get into things, I just wanted to mention that...
Nicky.
Yes, this is Nicky speaking. In one of our earlier episodes, it was our second episode on ties, I said something... I misused the word literally. I said literally
when I meant figuratively. And I
just wanted to make sure that you guys understood that I knew, or that I am very apologetic for misusing that word.
Especially since we had an episode on grammar and syntax.
And being
Nicky
sort of
was
true sticklers for correct grammar and syntax. And just...
He has to be a stickler on himself as well.
I have to be a stickler on myself.
So Nicky was a little bit of a hypocrite.
But I will argue that the thing is that I didn't use it. I didn't say literally on purpose to come across as more intelligent. It was merely an effect of my colloquialism. It was sort of my everyday language, and I misused a word by accident, but not in trying to seem smart.
I think most people use it by accident. It's just the way media uses it. And
that's true, but our syntax...
So much so that literally has, in fact, two definitions now in the dictionary. One is its normal usage, which is literally, meaning truly. And then also it means because people misused it so much colloquially that it has taken on the second definition of being figuratively also.
Which is its complete opposite.
Right. And I just don't, personally, I don't adhere to that second definition. I just
we don't want to get
ridiculous.
off on a whole thing about that because we already had a grammar and syntax episode. Anyway, I apologize for misusing that word. I'll try not to make it happen again, but I won't make any guarantees. Anyway, art criticism, art critics. Immediately, I think of film critics first because I feel like film critics maybe have the biggest influence out of critics in general because movies are so widely seen across the world, actually.
Right. Movies are ubiquitous,
I mean, I guess music critics have influence too, but I think people don't look to music critics as often as they look to film critics to decide whether or not to listen to
I mean, you definitely see critics...
music or watch a movie.
People will quote... Well, same with theater critics, I will argue that as well. But certainly film critics have a little bit more of an influence because, they're shown internationally. And people see, films will quote, their advertisements will quote critics in an effort to sell the movie better,
Right. I mean, theater does that too, but theater is usually specific to the city it's playing in.
Right.
Even if a show's on tour, it might quote critics from a specific city. It's not, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, theater will, yeah, that's right. I suppose it, actually come to think about it, all the arts will do that too. They'll quote any good critic.
But the thing about films, about films, especially big films, is they usually play internationally, and theater doesn't tend to do that unless it's a really popular show. Right. Anyway, so what do we think about art critics? I think it's, I don't like the idea of art criticism when it comes from most critics because...
Well, actually, hold on, Nicky. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I mean, art criticism can actually be very good and be put to very good use. I mean,
yes, and
musicians like us, we actually depend on that a lot because how else is our music going to get out there? How is people aren't going to know about our music? Unless there is art criticism, unless people review our stuff.
Well, that is one of the pros of art criticism. Then that it helps smaller bands like us succeed in
and get noticed
in the art world,
right? And even still, and someone that may not actually be. I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but someone that may not have a whole lot of experience necessarily in the technical aspects of an art form, like somebody who hasn't done a film, that doesn't necessarily mean, I don't know if that necessarily means all the time that they can't criticize to a good, to an intelligent degree a film. I think that just means, if they're very knowledgeable about film, they could be very perceptive about things.
You're getting ahead of yourself now because we have a whole world to
I know we'll
discuss
discuss that. We'll discuss that in a bit.
Second,
we'll discuss that in a bit.
We'll
I just want to make that clear, though. That
this episode is in no way a sort of undermining of art criticism, because art criticism is important in general in the world of art. But we just wanted to talk about for this episode what we see as the pros and cons of art criticism.
Right.
Anyway, our critics. Who says these critics
are the end all be all on
what validates them to be critics in the first place? I mean, a lot of them seemingly have never been involved actively in the arts before. I mean,
some of them are.
A couple of them have made films or done music, but a lot of them haven't. They're just moviegoers or music lovers, and
and they may have. They may have a point in what they're saying sometimes, but Nicky's right. What
qualifies them?
Yeah, what qualifies them as
be
the sort of
voice for the masses.
For the masses, right?
If anything, they aren't the voice for the masses, because there are a lot of popular movies and music and that become popular in spite of the negative criticism that they get.
Here's an example comes to mind is Siskel and Ebert, or Ebert and Roper, in the next incarnation of that show at the movies. Now, Siskel, from what I understand, had never done anything in film, if I'm correct. Isn't that right, Nicky?
As far as I could believe.
Right.
And Ebert all he did was a couple of Russ Meyer films.
And Russ Meyer was just a smut filmmaker, basically.
He was known to be like a B filmmaker. And so, Roger Ebert essentially wrote bad screenplays before he became a film critic.
I know. And so what qualifies him just because... And he won a Pulitzer for his art criticism.
I think before he even wrote a screenplay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, for his film criticism, he won a Pulitzer, and I just think, okay, maybe because it was well written, I guess that's why he won it. But I don't know. It just seems like what qualifies him as
a better critic than your average moviegoer,
Or someone, I guess he is very knowledgeable about film. That's true. I will say that. But as far as the filmmaking
I consider myself a movie buff, a television buff, a music buff, just buff in general.
Okay.
And so I feel like, I could, talk about, films in a sort of a critical manner. And I do that, I actually did start a movie blog a couple years ago. I didn't really do many reviews, but I did a few. And the point is, who would want to listen to me, give film criticism? I do know what I'm talking about, and I'm very specific with the things I like and don't like. But I guess what qualifies me is that I have done those things before. I've been involved in filmmaking process. I've been involved in the music process. Max and I are both musicians, and we've done a lot of acting in the past. And
sure, but whatever. The point is, even you, what difference does it make what you have to say?
Well, no,
I guess the ultimate point is, it should be that you don't depend on somebody else for their opinion of a movie. Go see it yourself if you're genuinely interested in seeing a movie.
No.
And then it is, I guess what it is fun though, because Nicky and I did watch a lot of episodes of At the Movies, because at the end of the day, it is fun to watch people discuss something, because sometimes it validates your opinion somehow, maybe, or sometimes it's just interesting to see an opposing view. And I don't know, just for the sake of, it's just fun to discuss those things.
It's fun that
right?
there is a discussion about something that you're interested in.
That's true, right? Something that you're interested in. It's fun that there's a discussion about it. I suppose that's just a fun thing to watch.
I just want to move back for a second. I think you're wrong, Max. I actually do think certain people are more qualified to give criticism than others. I know you might not.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that.
I actually think that people.
T.O., hold on. Let me just get this out before you get on your thing. I'm not saying that there aren't people more qualified to give criticism. There are people who I think are more qualified. I'm just saying, at the end of the day, one should take criticism with a grain of salt. That person is a different person than you. What they value in a movie or in a piece of art is completely different than what you value.
Okay.
And so go see the movie, see if you agree with that person.
But here's the thing:
just because you
somebody who like a filmmaker that I respect, like Quentin Tarantino, for example, I will consider his criticism
more
valuable than somebody like a Roger Ebert or Richard Roeper or Michael Phillips, because he's actually involved in film and he's made some really great works of art. And so if I know that somebody's involved in the business of art, actively pursuing it as their careers, then I know that they know what it's like to try to put on a show, to try to create something. And I know that they understand the obstacles that come along with trying to pursue those passions. And I think when you understand the obstacles, you begin to appreciate the technical value, the technical side, and I guess the aesthetic side of art in general.
It's true. Here's what I have to say. I think people that, in our opinion, as Nicky said, that should be qualified to make criticism, you can follow their advice and recommendations to go see a movie, but definitely don't, just because you respect that person and think they're qualified to make a criticism, don't let that, don't let that affect your movie-going experience. You should form your own opinion yourself.
Right.
Now, I think personally, personally, I actually don't even like to listen to criticism before I've seen a movie, though. Nowadays, I'm just all about going in kind of with a blank slate. I don't even want to listen to friends talk about it, because I don't want their opinions to influence my watching. Because whether or not I do form my own opinions, but sometimes people who overhype a movie, it might be underwhelming in the end to you because it didn't meet those expectations. Or on the contrary, you might try so hard in your mind to reach those,
because it's been hyped up
expectations so much that they've created for you, that
you might create a phony sort of idea of your actual opinion of the movie. It might make you think the film or song or play was better than it actually was to you.
Right.
It's like a phony reality.
Right. I guess really what it comes down to, you got to be real with yourself.
what did you actually
be
think
honest
of
with
this?
yourself? But still, it's hard. Sometimes, like, there is some subconscious thing, that you might be picking apart a movie and you're trying to validate a thing. Maybe something seems forced in it, but because people that you respect said it was good, you might try and validate the reasons for those things being forced. You know what I mean? So,
Our siblings, we respect their opinions a lot. Our older siblings, and they do have an influence on the way we think about things. Much less so these days than they used to. But I will consider their opinions more than most people's.
right, and that's not to say also, by the way, you should be open-minded to changing your opinions upon hearing somebody else's argument, actually. I think that's a good thing.
Right. And here's an example of a movie that has received some backlash, even though the majority of people and critics have given it great, glowing reviews, is the movie La La Land. We talked about La La Land in a previous episode, but we wanted to say that, there's been some backlash, but a lot of that backlash is sort of unfounded. It's only been created because people jump on this bandwagon, listening to other people give a negative review of it, and they don't even know why they're really giving it a negative review. They are just doing it just because they want to jump on the bandwagon, and it becomes sort of this politicized snowball effect. But in actuality, I think most filmmakers really, I would like to think that they really appreciate a film like La La Land for its technical achievements. I mean, what Damien Chazelle created is really a
real accomplishment,
work of art, just a feat, a groundbreaking feat in movie making experience, film history. I think So I guess regardless of any backlash that you may have heard of the film, it's still has received glowing reviews throughout the whole world, and I think you should go see it yourself.
Go form your own opinions. As we were saying before, don't follow the reviews necessarily. Although somebody's advice you can heed, as I said, but always take things with a grain of salt and
that's
go
why
see it yourself.
I have a problem with some of these aggregator film review sites like Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic. People look to Rotten Tomatoes and say, oh, that movie got a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. It must be good. Or alternatively, somebody might say, oh, that movie only got 34% on Rotten Tomatoes. It must be bad. And I think it's worthy to note that Rotten Tomatoes doesn't take into account how good of a review it was. So it might barely have passed sort of mediocre standing. It
might have gotten a tomato.
With many critics, it might have
been certified fresh. Is that what it's called, right?
It might have been, yeah. But what I'm trying to say is many critics might have said, I guess this is good enough for me to give a thumbs up or 3 stars or 2.5 star. It might have got 2.5 star reviews.
Okay.
But all of those combined, if those were all good, technically good reviews, it would still get a high percentage on Rotten Tomatoes. And so I don't think it's a good site to look at. Alternatively, for some of my favorite films, like The Baxter, that didn't get a good percentage on Rotten Tomatoes. But again, I think it's the idea that film critics, especially a lot of film critics, are older people, and they don't they're not able to tap into a younger.
They're not hip, basically.
They're not hip. They can't understand sort of a certain mindset, maybe a certain sense of humor that is popular amongst younger people or hipper people. The Baxter is one of my favorite comedies of all time, and yet it was not reviewed so well by Ebert and Roper. But I think they just didn't get it. They didn't understand the sense of humor.
It's
thing. Really, really also, funny.
Siskel and Ebert didn't review the Hudsucker Proxy as well. Or is it the Hudsucker's Proxy?
It's the Hudsucker Proxy.
The Hudsucker Proxy. They didn't review that very well, and that's like top 5 material right there.
It's maybe my favorite film of all time. Same with speaking of the Coen brothers, The Big Lebowski. They both said they didn't like the movie. They didn't think it was funny, and
that was from a lot of people who just not even moviegoers, but just just a lot. I mean,
But
normal
younger
moviegoers,
people will
younger
say
people think that's just their
their
favorite
favorite.
comedy of all time. And I actually probably will say that it's probably tied for my favorite comedy, maybe top 3 comedies of all time.
I remember watching Gene Siskel review it, and him saying that he didn't understand the one scene where he's hallucinating and flying over the bowling alley, and he thought that it was some sort of reference to Superman. But I was thinking to myself, what is he talking about? This is, I mean, it's not a reference to Superman, but even if it were,
is it actually?
I don't know.
I didn't even think
I'm
about
not
it
sure.
when I was watching it.
I'm not
but
sure, but
it doesn't
it's
even matter.
It doesn't
it's
even
irrelevant.
It's
actually,
irrelevant.
he's hallucinating.
It's not so. It seems to be like Siskel's sort of mindset was that sense of humor or humor in general has to mean something, and it has to be thought about. Whereas I think the Coen brothers' intention was more so to just give an experience. It's sort of a visceral experience where something is just funny because it is, or something is interesting or cool because it is. You don't have to think about it so much. There might be some underlying things going on.
Right, and that's what the Coen brothers do a lot of. There's a lot of symbolism sometimes in their movies, and
which you can think about it,
you can think of after the film. But it's also
viewing,
could be just something that's interesting to watch too. It's like
David Lynch.
David Lynch will sometimes just put stuff in his movies, just because he thinks it's kind of a weird thing to do, and he thinks that's kind of like real life in a way.
And he likes
that there's weird stuff that happens, and there's nothing that and it's open to interpretation what you want. But really, the reason it's in there is just because life is kind of weird, Things. If you just took a shot, if you did like a little minute sequence of just 2 people having conversation, even like maybe 10 seconds of their conversation, it might seem so out of place and so weird to even think about what they're talking about because you have no idea what the context is of their conversation, really. And I think he does that kind of stuff in his movies on purpose because that's kind of like real life,
Roger Ebert was a big opponent of David Lynch for a long time until I think Straight Story came out or Mulholland Drive came out. He didn't like most of his movies because he thought it was just weird for being the sake of being weird or something like that. But that's what makes it so subjective. Is sometimes weird for the sake of being weird is cool.
Right. And see, you go. The point is on these critics though is they may not know what the hell they're talking about.
I mean, same with music. The Beach Boys' very famous album, Pet Sounds, it didn't get great reviews in America upon its release. In England, it got reviewed very well. And even Paul McCartney says that God Only Knows his favorite song of all time. And it didn't sell amazingly in the U.S. upon its initial release.
It did actually not. I mean, by today's standards, it did wonderful.
But
by
to
Brian
the 60s
Wilson, he wasn't pleased with the sales.
But the point is, it's now gone down in history as one of the greatest pop albums of all time, and I think criticism has changed over the years for that album, and so in a way, it's still subjective. You don't. The way a critic might feel, or critics in general might feel about a work of art today might change in the next few decades, and their opinions might change of that work of art.
That happens all the time. I mean, they're oftentimes those cult classics, they're called cult classics because there was an audience, in spite of the negative reviews it got, there was an audience for those films, and it gained cult status, and then it found an audience, So there's things that, the critics just don't. It goes over their heads, but it may not go over yours. So don't follow the critics all the time. I know we talked about movies a lot. We just are big movie fans. I mean, we're big music fans too.
Obviously, I mean, we do music for a living.
The thing is, here's the thing. Everybody's a critic now too. I mean, there's so many blogs out there, and there's people out there make music blogs, and everyone is. It's just so weird. Everyone has their own subjective taste to things, I mean,
and it's almost like
it's hard to really
what qualifies anybody to write about anything. I guess anybody can do it, and
I guess it's like,
just such a weird thing where certain blogs or media, print media gets so popular that a good write-up from that source means everything, So if you get a good write-up from Pitchfork, it means a really good thing, but
essentially,
what are those
I guess
guys really? What makes them, the end-all be-all of everything?
Right. Essentially, basically, I guess we don't have a problem with people writing criticism. That's fine.
I think it's great. I mean,
it's great to discuss, but
it's
I think
really interesting.
The influence that criticism has on the consequences, or the influence it has on the success of a piece of art, is the problem we have with it. The critics really shouldn't have that much power, actually, and that's the problem we have with it, with criticism.
That said, the critics do have power to help make a movie or an album succeed, and that's a good thing. If they review a smaller film really, really well, then it has a better chance of making its money back, and that's a good thing. It has a good chance of making a larger audience watch that film.
I know, but still, I mean, you can't just say it's good. I mean, yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I kind of still think that, I don't know, the critics just have too much power.
They do have,
there's too much
there's
power.
Too much power, especially when there's, all sorts of outlets like award shows, which already kind of sort of help make those smaller projects succeed. Sometimes they don't.
It's like the Tonys, for instance. They're only for Broadway shows, and yet there's so much off-Broadway stuff that is good too, and it's like, how are those going to get any notice?
Or shows that are not even in New York,
Right. I guess like they're only going to get noticed from write-ups, I guess, from critics. I mean, I guess you're right. I see what you're saying, Nicky. It's good to get a write-up that's good, because how else is that show going to get noticed, right?
Here's the thing.
I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a weird thing.
Is it the kind of thing where critics should only do write-ups if they liked what they saw, and or like what they heard, and if they didn't, they should just pass on doing a write-up on it? I mean, they shouldn't spread negativity about it, but rather only spread positivity, and if they can't get themselves to do that, then just don't write anything at all?
No, I don't know, because sometimes people genuinely think something is good, but they don't necessarily, they're not going to write up about it, you know what I mean? So that's also giving...
I don't know, that's different from what I was just saying.
I know it is a little bit different, but what I'm trying to say is, even the critic is being selective in their write-ups too. Still, I mean, they can't possibly write everything up.
What I'm saying though is, should a critic only write good reviews and not write bad reviews? Because with a bad review, you're not helping anybody except maybe preventing somebody from going to see a movie or listening to an album. But that should be for them to decide whether or not to spend their money on that piece of art. It's a critic. I think I'm just starting to think like maybe a critic should only choose to write good reviews, and if they didn't like the piece of art, then they shouldn't write a review at all.
That happens often with I guess when you get on the bigger level, I guess, music criticism will write negative reviews, but oftentimes on blogs they won't write a review if it's a bad,
if they didn't like it.
I think that's the case, right? If it's an album that they didn't like, they just won't write about it, I suppose. If it's a band trying to make
unless it's a bigger media source,
right? Or exactly. If it's a big enough band, then you're subjected to maybe
more
harsher
negative
criticism.
But that's not true.
Harsher good, or I shouldn't say harsher, but more. You're subjected to positive and negative. I guess the whole spectrum of criticism. I guess more.
Well,
whereas if you're a smaller band, then you won't get necessarily written about at all. Actually,
that's not necessarily true for film, though. Small films do get negatively criticized. I really don't have a good feel. It gives me a bad feeling when a small movie, even if it's, even if it's bad, if it's negatively criticized by a lot of critics, quote unquote critics, then it's just discouraging to the filmmaker, especially somebody this might be their first film or something like that.
Right. It's already discouraging enough not to get written about actually at all.
Right.
So to write a negative review, I mean, at the same time, you could say like, well, if that person just is not having any talent, like, are you going to let them keep going? I don't know. It's kind of
right. I guess thing. So.
I guess
it's weird.
If they had good enough friends, they'll tell them, look, this you gotta. I think if they're not getting rid up about, I think they'll just think. That's already discouraging enough, and so if they think they really have something there, just let them keep going. I guess whatever ultimately is gonna make. Yeah, I guess ultimately it's like, why spread negativity when it's actually not? It's not conducive to anything.
Yeah, it's not helping anybody.
All right. Well, and anyway, I just do want to mention that we haven't mentioned some of the other arts, like
fine arts,
and that's probably because
they're so subjective to.
No, that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say we haven't mentioned it because we're actually not knowledgeable on that area of criticism. Actually,
this is not to say we don't know. We don't know anything about it. We do know something about
fine
arts.
But I will say that we don't really quite. I'm saying we don't know about criticism regarding that stuff.
But in a sense, though, then we might be more like the average fine art appreciator. And
right, we know a little bit of something about fine arts.
In that sense, it truly becomes a subjective thing. You look at a piece of art and you think, is this good or not? To you, does this make you feel anything? Is this good to you? But that's the truest, version of being a critic. Your own critic is,
sure,
do you like this or not?
But at the same time, there is something to be said for knowing the history of a subject, I guess, because then you can really appreciate it for everything it's worth. But with that said, what does it matter? If you like it, then you like it, and if you don't, who cares? It's like, I don't know. It's like going to see a movie. The whole point of movies in the first place was to go escape. And, you didn't need to know the history about it. It was just
that's what makes a movie like La La Land so great. It's truly an escape kind of movie.
Right. Well, what makes La La Land so good is it's an escape for people. And then also, if you know a little something about film as well, it's even more of a treat for you.
Exactly.
That I think is the mark of a true piece of art, is something that is multi-layered.
Can please all audiences.
It can please all audiences. Yes. That goes for our feeling about comedy too. But that's another.
Comedy is a.
That's a whole other episode to deal with.
That's a whole other episode. Real quickly on comedy. Some comedians will say you can't criticize it unless you've done it yourself. And I've talked to comedians.
Who said that?
I'm not going to name names, but.
Well, that ain't true. You're performing for an audience that doesn't do comedy.
That's true.
Usually,
but comedy is a whole other subject.
That's
another
subject.
Episode. That's another subject that we'll talk about.
I'd say
later.
the final word is, for art critics, I generally think they wield too much power, but sometimes that power can be put to good use, I suppose.
Our critics shouldn't negatively criticize openly a piece of art in printed media. It should only be put to good use. And
that is something that's actually interesting to talk about. I suppose you're right. I guess,
it's hard to say, I think when you've reached a certain popularity or level of popularity, maybe
if you've reached a certain level of success,
then I think it's okay for critics maybe to negatively comment on your work of art, because then it keeps you in check as an artist, and it makes you realize, okay, what could I have done differently, and what can I I will have a chance to redeem
Right.
myself in the future. Whereas
But-
a smaller artist might not have a chance to redeem him or herself in the future because they're.
But sometimes people's careers are killed by just a movie they did that received bad criticism, and I think that is when I think critics, have too much power. I also think they have too much power in their influence over people is what I am trying to say ultimately.
So the final word is
the final word is don't critics take critics
our criticism with a grain of salt.
Take it with a grain of salt. See
Go
yourself,
judge it for yourself.
Judge it for yourself.
Don't
By all
fall into
means, take the recommendations if you want.
Don't fall into any bandwagon.
Don't fall into bandwagon schnip.
Just create your own opinion. Just
Create your own opinion.
How do you honestly feel about this piece of art?
Yes.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Splitting Hairs with Max and Nicky.
And please tune in next time.